A friend of mine recently asked if I would build them a gaming PC. The hype surrounding the launch of NVIDIA's new 3000 series of RTX graphics cards leads me to believe that there's a lot of other folks out there who would either like to build a PC for the first time or perhaps upgrade from a pre-built unit. Now, for this build, we're going to be using a GTX 1080 because the RTX 3080 is on back order and we might not get it for a month or two. This video focuses solely on the assembly. Part selection is not covered. We will walk step by step through each component and how it connects into the PC. Let's jump right in. For starters, I have a MSI Z490 Gaming Edge motherboard. This is for an Intel chip. Next up, I have an Intel Core i5. This is a 10th gen CPU chip. You can use AMD as well. Next is the hard drive. This is a solid state hard drive, DDR4 RAM. A power supply unit. It's a 750 watt. I have an air cooler for the CPU. Lastly, I have this case here. I'll pull it out of the box. Okay, so I'm going to set the case aside. And next up, we're going to get going on the motherboard. Now, at this stage, some people are worried about electrostatic discharge and shocks that could damage the sensitive computer equipment. Personally, I've never found static discharge to be much of an issue, but if you want to play it safe, you can protect your investment by purchasing a static bracelet online. They can be had for under $10. Next, we're going to unbox and install the Intel processor. Here's the chip. It's very important to avoid touching the bottom during the installation process. In order to install the CPU, we must first access the socket on the motherboard. I'm going to remove the shield covering the CPU socket. To do this, I'm going to unlatch right here by pushing down and pulling towards me. And the retaining mechanism is loose and will now flip up, and I can remove the shield here. It's very important not to touch any of the pins in there. If you break any of those pins or mess with the bottom of the chip, you may need to replace those components. You'll notice that on the side of the chip, there's these indentations here and here. Those align with the indents here and here on the socket. So I'm going to take the chip, lightly set it on the pins. And now I'm going to add the tension back by pushing down here. And it does take some force. Now the CPU is installed. Next, I'm going to install the CPU cooler. This thing is an absolute monster. So this piece is the heatsink pad, and it will sit directly on top of the CPU that we just installed. The heat will then be dissipated up and blown away with the fans. Regardless of if you use an air cooler like this one or a water cooler, the principle is the same. It mounts directly on the CPU with a thin layer of thermal paste in between to facilitate heat transfer. Each cooler's mounting bracket system will vary slightly, so be sure to read the instructions. This component of the mounting bracket sits behind the motherboard. I'm going to align it with the two screws on the bottom of the CPU socket. There's only one way it can be properly attached. Flip the board back over, and now you see the posts on all sides of the CPU here. Next, we're going to take these supplied rubber grommets. There's a lot of junk here to install if you had an AMD CPU as well. You know what? That goes the other way. A little pad on the bottom there. Every CPU cooler has a proprietary mounting system. Yours might look different than what you're seeing here. So the next step is to drop the cooler on top of the CPU chip. It's very important that we remove this plastic from the bottom or you won't get the proper heat dissipation effects. Before seating the cooler down, I'm gonna clean and apply thermal paste to the top of the CPU. And I'm also gonna screw the mounting brackets down. I'm using my own thermal compound here, but at the end of the day, the differences between different brands and formulations is relatively insignificant, so don't stress. Now, before I apply the thermal compound, I'm gonna use a little bit of rubbing alcohol here to get my huge fingerprint off of there. Notice how I apply a pea-sized amount of the thermal compound directly in the center of the chip. So I'm going to seat this down. Once you push down, you really don't want to move it around. Again, every cooler is different, so the assembly process you see here may or may not line up with your build. A very important and often overlooked issue is to ensure cooler compatibility with your case. While most people check that the motherboard is correctly sized and that the graphics card length is acceptable, I notice that people sometimes forget to check that the cooler height is allowable in the case, and then accidentally discover that it sticks out too far, preventing them from reattaching the case's side panel. With closed-loop water coolers, like the Corsair H100i that I have in my main build, height is less of an issue, but you need to confirm that there is sufficient room to mount a radiator in the case. The last step is to connect the fans into the fan header on the motherboard. This way they can receive the power they need to run. You can also fine-tune their speed and when they kick on from within the BIOS. Okay, cooler installation is complete. Next, we're going to move to the hard drives. This is our Samsung 970 EVO. It's a 1 terabyte solid state hard drive that connects through an M.2 port on the motherboard. It's amazing how small memory has gotten. I'm gonna need a small screwdriver. So modern motherboards have M.2 ports in a bunch of different locations. This one has one here with a heat spreader on top. This is the one we're gonna use. There's also another M.2 port here, and often, not on this one, often there is a M.2 slot on the bottom of the unit as well. And sometimes there'll be an M.2 port that's obstructed, and that would be for like a small Wi-Fi card or something shorter in length than this. But in this case, I'm just going to unscrew the heat spreader. And in hindsight, I probably should have done this before installing the heatsink on the CPU because I'm a little bit blocked here, but this should be okay. And all you do is click the solid state hard drive in like so, and reinstall the heat spreader. But that's that. It's time to install the RAM. I have 64 gigabytes of DDR4 memory here, which is overkill for gaming. 32 gigabytes is plenty sufficient to play the AAA games of today. This memory has a speed of 3200 megahertz and a cache latency of 16. Each generation of CPU seems to have a sweet spot of RAM speed and latency. Go above those numbers and the returns diminish rapidly. Keep this in mind when shopping for RAM. So the first thing I noticed, here are the 4 RAM slots. That's pretty standard on motherboards. The first thing that I noticed is the cooler is overhanging on this RAM slot. I did not expect that. So what I'm gonna do, I think, is move the fan slightly up. There's only one direction that RAM can be installed. So you need to make sure that this slot here aligns on the motherboard. And one of the 2 sides will click back. Sometimes both sides do. Oh, on this motherboard, both sides click back. Usually, I've noticed it's just one side. So all I'm gonna do is slot the RAM in and push down, and it's pretty firm. You're not gonna break anything. Both sides snap in. So I'm gonna do that with the other 3 sticks. It's time to install the motherboard into the case. I'm going to remove the tempered glass cover, being careful not to scratch the glass. This case, as you can see, has come with fans that are pre-installed. If you buy a case, often it won't have fans and you have to buy and install those separately, and they'll all link into the motherboard. So for starters, I'm just going to get some of the stuff out of the way, and then we will connect the motherboard. The first thing to note is your mounting brackets for the motherboard. There's little posts. This one supports ATX, micro ATX, and ITX, as you can see from the posts. Some of the smaller cases, might only support ITX if it's really small or something like that, but this is big enough that it supports all sizes. So all I'm going to do is take the motherboard here and gently lower it into the case, and these holes here will align with the posts. Some motherboards, especially those on the lower end, will come packaged with an I/O shield that must first be snapped into the case prior to lowering the motherboard down into it. In this case, it's all one unit. A little bit of a tight squeeze there. And I actually forgot to reattach this fan above the RAM, so I'm going to do that. Next, I'm going to secure the motherboard to the case with the included screws or hardware here. Motherboard screws typically have a small rounded top. The next step is to install the power supply and route the power into the 24-pin ATX connector. And then this case is very tight, but there's an 8-pin CPU connector down in front of or behind the heatsink here. So this 24-pin powers everything on the board, with the exception of the 8-pin, which powers the CPU. And then when we install the graphics card last, that has its own power. So everything is going to be unique and particular to your case. This one has a back panel area here for cable management and hiding unsightly cables. And then the power supply sits here and butts up against the back side of the case there. And this is a fully modular power supply, meaning that there are no cables coming out of the back, and you choose from this bucket here only the ones that you need to power your computer. This is a 750 watt power supply, which I think is ideal for most. If you intend to run multiple graphics cards in an SLI or Crossfire arrangement, then perhaps you would want to purchase a 1000 watt power supply. When selecting a PSU, I do a rough calculation of max power draw. The CPU and graphics card will draw the most, typically between 70 and 150 watts for the CPU and around 200 to 350 watts for the GPU. I will then add 50 to 100 watts for the motherboard and another 10 watts per hard drive, RAM module, optical drive, or other peripheral device. Because power supply efficiency is a bell curve, with the greatest efficiency between 25% and 75% power draw, my goal is to purchase a power supply that overshoots the maximum system draw by 200 to 300 watts. So let's bring the case back into the picture. Before I connect the power supply to the case with screws on this side, I'm gonna prepare and connect the cables that I know I'm gonna need to power the machine in advance. So that would be 2 PCIe cords. These should all come with your power supply. I have, this is CPU power. I actually need 2 of these. And lastly is the 24-pin ATX connector that will power the rest of the system in the motherboard. First, I'm going to take the 24-pin connector. One side is a solid piece and one's broken up. I'm going to plug the broken up unit in to the back of the power supply here. Make sure it's firmly seated. I'm going to connect a PCIe connector here There are 3 different types of connectors that attach to the power supply. The 24-pin ATX, which powers the motherboard, 8-pin PCIe or CPU connectors, which are interchangeable and power the graphics card and CPU, and 6-pin connectors, which are a catch-all for other devices, such as SATA hard drives and other peripherals. And that should cover the bases. So I'm going to slide the power supply back into the case. I'm aligning the fan with the vent on the bottom of the case here. Next, I'm going to feed the power cables where I know they need to go. So the ATX connector goes on this side of the motherboard. If you need to spin the case around and check the locations of different cables, that's totally fine. I'm going to take the 2 CPU cables here and route them into the top. And I'm going to feed the 2 PCIe cables through the similar slot as the motherboard ATX connector so I can connect them into the graphics card when we get to that. Cable management is definitely more art than it is science, and you can decide how much time you want to spend on it. So back on the front side, you can see here is the power supply that we just installed. The first thing I'm going to do is take the ATX connector and plug it into the motherboard here. There's only one direction it can fit, and you push down until it snaps in. It's okay if the motherboard bends a little bit. Now these 2 cables here are PCIe cables, and they're for the graphics card, which will sit right here. In this case, because the space I'm working in is so tight, I'm going to remove the pre-installed fan. So I did manage to get my hand down there and plug the CPU power connectors in. In hindsight, I should have connected them in before putting the motherboard in. Worst case scenario, I just would have removed the motherboard, attached them, and screwed it back in, but I'm glad I got that to work. The last piece to install is the graphics card in lieu of a 3080, which should arrive shortly. I'm going to use this GTX 1080 and then swap it out when the new one comes in. So I could use either of these PCIe slots. This one's reinforced, you can tell, the extra metal. It's meant for a big, heavy graphics card. The graphics card is also last because it mounts to the edge of the case. Before attaching the graphics card, the blanks on the side of the case need to be removed. I'm simply going to slot the graphics card down into the PCIe slot on the motherboard. I'm going to reattach the screws on the side here to secure the card in place. And lastly, I'm going to connect the power. This is an 8 and a 6 pin. I know the RTX 30 series are going to have a different type of connector that I believe requires an adapter. The final step in the build process is to attach the case's front panel to the motherboard, starting with the power and reset buttons, as well as the LED indicator lights for power and hard drive. Consult the manual, but it's typical for them to be located at the bottom of the motherboard with the power LED and power switch next to each other on the top and the hard disk LED and reset switch on the bottom with an unused 9th pin on the bottom right. It can sometimes be tricky to plug these in correctly, and I've certainly gotten it wrong at times and had to go back and readjust the way the pins are connected. You'll find out very quickly if the computer does not turn on, for example, and you have the power switch in the wrong area. Depending on the particulars of your case and setup, you might also want to take the time to hook up any USB 2.0 or 3.0 ports that are built into the case, headphone or microphone jacks, case fans, RGB that plugs directly into the motherboard, or any SATA hard disk drives that were not covered during the earlier hard disk installation. Anyways, that's it, folks. Booting up is always stressful and the moment of truth. Remember that if the computer fails to start, there's probably nothing wrong. Usually something is just hooked up incorrectly or the RAM or graphics card is not fully seated. If you have an issue that you can't resolve, feel free to drop a comment below. Good luck and happy building.